Hey, I'm Trey K, and you're listening to Us and Them, the show that tells the stories about the things that divide Americans. In this episode, how an Illinois college town pushed a man out of his job.
Dear university community, I have informed the Board of Trustees that June 30th, 2019 will be my last day as president of Western Illinois University.
That's Jack Thomas, Western Illinois University's first African-American president. While college presidents come and go, Thomas's resignation stands out. It came at the end of an ugly campaign to remove him. The university is in Western Illinois, in the small rural community of Macomb. The majority white town is closer to the Missouri and Iowa borders than it is to Chicago, which is about 4 hours away. Macomb's population has been declining for years. The university is the community's economic saving grace. It's what keeps this small city of 17,000 on the map. I learned about what happened at Western Illinois University from journalist Jack Stripling. He called attention to President Thomas's departure in his Chronicle of Higher Education story called Fear of a Black Campus. Stripling told me that as the university recruited more students of color, there was resistance.
Through the course of my reporting, we found emails and documents that showed that trustees, even faculty members, were very suspicious of the degree to which the university was coming to look different than it had in the past. And we heard from guidance counselors who said that students who were white students who might otherwise have come to the university might be having second thoughts because they were concerned about the growing number of, quote, inner city students that are now coming to Macomb. So there's, unfortunately, a fair amount of evidence that there are pockets of resistance to this change in, as I say, a majority white community.
And I want to come back to this part of the antipathy and the concern that people in the town have. But I just want to ask about Macomb. How important is Western Illinois University to the economy of the town?
It's really everything. It's far and away the largest employer. There's some manufacturing jobs there, which exist. But one of the things that this story is about is the degree to which Macomb has sort of fallen prey to macroeconomic forces. And the best way you can demonstrate that is through what's happened to the farms in Macomb and the surrounding area. You used to be able to make a decent living running a family farm in this part of the country, and that's just not the case anymore. Those small farms have all been bought up by huge operations that span thousands of acres, and there's just precious little room for people who used to make a living that way, which makes the university's continued vibrancy all the more important.
In your piece, you describe the controversy over President Jack Thomas, and you describe it as an us and them battle. How is that?
Well, I think we should take a step back to where the university was around this past spring. The institution had suffered huge enrollment declines, years and years of budget cuts, and layoffs of at least 100 people. So there was growing frustration among people who live and work in Macomb, whether they were affiliated with the university or not, about the state of the institution. People who run small businesses in the town are having trouble making a living because there's just fewer students who are frequenting their stores and restaurants. And so there was a town and gown conflict here where people who saw the university's fortunes decline saw their own income decline as well, and there was great frustration about this. And then this past spring, as things were sort of reaching a boiling point.
Wait, hang on.
Yeah.
Why was there such a steep drop-off of the student enrollment?
Well, there's a couple of reasons for this. I mean, one is this is a hard case to make to, an 18-year-old kid, right? Get on a train out of Chicago, drive a couple of hours through a bunch of cornfields and make a life here to have a fun time in college. I mean, people love the town and people who live there say they would never leave, but how much does this appeal to a large swath of modern students who have other options? That's one thing. The other thing is the demographic issues we've been talking about, which is, You don't have as big a population of high school students who grew up in the region, whose parents went to Western Illinois. Those kids just aren't as plentiful as they once were. And as you know, lots of institutions are competing for those students. And so this is a story of regional public universities across the country. And if you look even at the universities in Illinois, I think more than half of them have had enrollment declines in recent years. So Western Illinois isn't alone. And it really is those demographic reasons.
And I've been reading in Illinois that there was, over the past couple of years, an impasse at their legislative level with regard to a budget. Did that have an impact on the funding that the university was getting?
Yeah, that's a huge part of this story. So in 2015, Illinois did not approve a budget for 2 years. And this forced universities, including Western, to make some really tough economic choices, lay people off, cut budgets. But I'm sure that it affected outreach and recruitment as well.
So you were telling me before, you said that you needed me to kind of understand where we were last spring, in the spring of 2019. Take me back there. So what was happening then?
Yeah, at that point, Jack Thomas was moving toward his 8th year as president of the university. And increasingly, the local community was impatient with what they saw as the lack of progress that had happened under his tenure, and they thought it was time for new leadership. That's not an uncommon occurrence in higher education. I mean, people get frustrated about presidents all the time. They come and go. I could spend my days writing about presidents getting fired. It happens. What was different here was the level of vitriol that was contained in a grassroots campaign to get rid of Jack Thomas. And the biggest manifestation of this was there's a theater, or it's really a bar now, in the center of town called the Forum. And they have a marquee that will usually say, tonight free drinks or whatever. Normally it'll be an advertisement for whatever's going on at the Forum, but on this particular day, the words "Fire Jack" were written on the marquee of the Forum. There were store owners and local residents who put Fire Jack signs in their shop front windows, who put them on lawns. And it didn't take long for people in the African American community to see some really troubling racial optics in this, which was an all-white town basically saying, get rid of the black guy. Despite what you might think about his performance, and we can have a legitimate debate about whether he was an effective president, and a lot of people would say no, this was a very controversial campaign, and one that I think deeply hurt black people in the community and other minorities who already felt a sense of isolation in this all-white town.
I know when I look at places like Macomb, and a story like this kind of pops up in national headlines in an article like yours, that the people in the town are going to say, well, wait a minute, they're portraying us as just a place of racist people. Did you talk to any of the folks there in Macomb and kind of get an idea of maybe why they felt this way? Did you speak with anybody who put a sign up in their window?
Yes and yes and yes. I talked to a bunch of people in the town. One of the things I did on the trip that I made to Macomb was I sat in on some really interesting workshops that an African-American leader in the community was running, where people came together to talk about this incident, why they thought it happened, and more broadly, racial tensions within the town. Now, I will tell you that it was mostly white people who showed up at these meetings, and that tells you something about the divide. There were not a lot of African Americans there for this conversation, and quite frankly, it was either liberal white people who were predisposed to think that there was racism in the town, or folks who were there to say, I don't have a racist bone in my body, and that's not what this is about. So that divide continues. I take your point about the trepidation that some people in a community might have about a reporter from Washington, D.C. swooping in for a couple of days and making assessments about the degree of racism that may exist in Macomb, Illinois. But the reporting here went well beyond the conversations that I had when I was in town there. We did significant public records requests, found a trail of documentation that showed, in one instance, a former university trustee saying to one of his colleagues, we need to have a serious conversation about the ethnicity of our university. There were, as I mentioned before, feedback from guidance counselors who were concerned about the changing demographics. There were emails from former faculty members who were saying that the, quote, Jack predicament cannot be separated from race. So this was a broader reporting effort that, yes, relied upon interviews and talking to people in the community, but there was a whole host of documentation that told a story about how people spoke in private, or what they thought was private, about these really contentious issues.
I'd just like to know a little bit about Jack Thomas. What can you tell me about him? I mean, did he get along with the people in the community? Did he make any effort to reach out and connect with them?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Jack Thomas grew up in a rural community in Alabama that was probably just as black as Macomb is white, but he is a product of the South. I think his parents both worked on farms, and he sort of worked his way up the academic ladder. He came to Western Illinois as provost, which is typically the second in command in an academic administration, and then was named president later. And the book on him was that he wasn't particularly social in the community. This guy has a PhD in literature. He's also an ordained minister, and he didn't really, I'm told he doesn't drink, so he didn't hang out downtown with sort of the local folks and mix it up with them in the way that other presidents might have. I talked to several people who described him as elitist, who described him as aloof.
Why would they think that?
I think that there was a sense that because he really only showed up at sort of official functions and wasn't part of the local poker circle, that maybe he thought he was better than people. Now, of course, we know as people who've talked and written about race that these are pretty loaded terms. Words like aloof are not that far from words like uppity. And so there's a tension even around that description of Jack Thomas. And when you talk to African Americans in the community, they would say, well, of course Jack Thomas didn't mix it up with the local people at the bars. I mean, he would have been very uncomfortable putting himself in a position where he might have been compromised, where he might have said something out of turn. He already felt isolated in the community. I mean, that's the feedback you hear from his African American supporters.
You have described the tension that was going on in Macomb, many, many concerns that the people had. What ultimately happened to Jack Thomas?
Well, right around the time of this campaign that I described, the Fire Jack campaign, Jack Thomas was on an annual contract, and the Board of Trustees were in a position to either renew it or not. And that was one of the reasons that this grassroots campaign evolved. They saw it as their sort of last best chance to convince the board that the guy had to go. But not long after this happened and before the board made a decision, Jack Thomas decided to resign as the president of the university. And that's basically the end of the story.
Coming up, Western Illinois University's ouster of President Jack Thomas stirs responses.
That sign on the square was viewed by many people as a symbolic public lynching of an African-American man who had a prominent position in a predominantly white community.
We must continue working together in the future, and we must promote healthy dialogue.
That's after this break.
Music lifts us up and brings us together, even when we can't get together in person. Mountain Stage brings you live performances on the air, online, and in our podcast. They remind you how it feels to be in a live audience listening to live music. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find a link to our stations and our podcast online at mountainstage.org.
I'm Trey Kay, and you're listening to Us and Them from West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX. This program is supported in part by the West Virginia Humanities Council and the CRC Foundation. I'm talking with reporter Jack Stripling about his story, Fear of a Black Campus, for the Chronicle of Higher Education. When Jack Thomas was forced from his job as Western Illinois University's first African-American president, the community, especially students, staff, and faculty, felt the impact. On the day Thomas resigned, during a University Board of Trustees meeting in June 2019, several people raised concerns about how things played out.
The WIU board and this community should know that sign on the square was viewed by many people, not only people of color, because they've told me, as a symbolic public lynching of an African-American man who had a prominent position in a predominantly white community. Now, we are left with a perception that there are people who do not want black and brown students at Western Illinois University. From my perspective, this is not the case, but this is a serious problem.
That's Ronald Williams. When he spoke up at this meeting, he was a professor at the university and also held 2 high-level administrative posts there. He had been working at the college for 11 years.
Unfortunately, there is a narrative that is being perpetuated that the decline in enrollment, the decline in rural populations, the lack of economic development in Macomb, and the consolidation of school systems in this area is President Thomas's fault. I believe some of that was even occurring prior to his arrival. However, it is unreasonable to assert that President Thomas should be held responsible for all that has happened in this region. Moreover, it is not the sole fault of undergraduate admissions. Our admissions staff is working hard to reverse the trend of declining enrollment at WIU. Recently, an external group asked admissions to send a survey to high school counselors to solicit information about things that may be contributing to the decline. The group requested that the survey be sent in paper form, and although the response rate to the paper survey has been low, the responses we did receive are overwhelmingly positive about the university and the admissions staff. However, one of the high school counselors used the survey as an opportunity to write that WIU should focus only on rural local students and that we should not have inner city students here. The person also wrote something to the effect that admissions must do this to make Western great again. Those are charged statements, and we must recognize it for what it is: hatred.
Ronald Williams has since left Macomb and Western Illinois University. I asked Stripling about how the university and the community responded to Williams's direct charges of racism in Macomb.
Well, Ron Williams, I think, was probably one of the most respected administrators at Western Illinois, period, not to mention African-American administrators. And he was in a unique position to speak truth to power, I think, as a lot of people saw this, because he had accepted a job elsewhere, in part because he was really fed up with what he saw as the racism of the town. So I was not in the room when he gave this address, but I've had a chance to talk to him and others subsequently. And it's interesting. Every time I called Dr. Williams, he would say, I don't want to talk about this. I put this behind me. And then, 30 minutes later, we're still talking about how upset he was. But I don't think that you have to be a scholar of African-American studies to know that phrases like symbolic public lynching are incredibly charged. And to hear him say that in a public forum, I think was very affirming to African-Americans in the community who were really waiting for someone to come forward and speak with that level of passion on this issue. I'd also want to call attention to the document that he mentioned, which we also obtained ourselves, which was this guidance counselor saying we need to make Western great again. That feeds into not only themes in our national politics because of the Trump administration's use of that phrase, but it's something that reoccurred in other documents that I acquired. We have a trustee who's at the center of this who described her efforts to restore Western Illinois to the days we remember so well. There is a hearkening among the principally white majority of this community to some bygone era that exists before this changing demography happens. So what's happening at the micro level at this university is very reflective of our national politics.
Jack, you wrote in your article that while Jack Thomas was president and worked in Macomb, he chose not to attend church there in the town, that he went and worshiped about an hour away. And you visited the First Baptist Church where he worshiped. Reverend Orville C. Jones used part of one of his sermons to talk about Thomas resigning. Let's listen to a little bit of that.
There ought to be something about separate yourself as a Christian that identifies you with being on the Lord's side. There ought to be something about how you handle yourself in the face of adversity. Oh, I'm saying something to you today. There ought to be something about how you handle the attacks of the enemy when they come at you from people who really are not the enemy, but are being used by the enemy to mess you up. There ought to be something different about it.
Seems like quite a sermon to have attended.
Yeah, I mean, I got to tell you, the highlight of my trip, no doubt. Reverend Jones is an incredibly dynamic speaker, and he is close friend and spiritual advisor to Jack Thomas. I found it very interesting as a reporter, based on everything I'd heard about Dr. Thomas, that he would choose to attend church about an hour away from Macomb. You know, I never got a great answer on why that might be, but I think we can make some inferences about that. He clearly wanted to build a spiritual community in a place that was outside of the city where he was president, and part of that may have been that he felt more comfortable in a different community. Some people held that against him too, but what I found so compelling was that this church family that he developed, and you know, he was very active in this church, they were wounded by this too, because they really idolized Jack Thomas. And to see him treated so shabbily as they viewed it was just the height of disrespect from the point of view of this congregation.
Jack, there was another video clip that you posted with your article, and it was from Martin Abraham. Now, can you remind me who Martin Abraham is?
The unluckiest man on the planet. Martin Abraham was named provost of Western Illinois University just around the time that Jack Thomas was resigning. So this position had been unfilled for some time. He was coming in to be second in command to Jack Thomas, and I think before he even gets in town, Jack Thomas quits.
And as a result, Martin Abraham goes from provost to acting president of the university. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Some of the things that I heard from our students was really heartbreaking, not just as a president, but as a member of the community. Many of our students and members of our community feel disenfranchised and marginalized. Some feel unwelcome, confused, and scared. I heard from students who came to Macomb because we have a reputation for being open and inclusive. They've loved their experiences at Western, but because of some of the events that have been going on recently in particular, they just don't feel comfortable here anymore. And in fact, some of them have changed their plans to stay here for graduate school. We need to change that. And that change needs to start here tonight, with everyone, not just here, but also beyond here.
You can really hear the emotion in Martin Abraham's voice. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, what I also hear is an evolution. Martin Abraham is white and came into this job, as I say, under really unfortunate circumstances. And when I met with him, he had only been there a short while, and I think he was still kind of trying to figure out what happened here. I think he was trying to understand how it affected the community, why emotions were so raw. So by the time he spoke at that event, which ironically was held at the Forum, which is where the marquee said "Fire Jack" that started this whole controversy, he had had an opportunity to really engage with the community. And it sounds to me, from that clip at least, that he understood the gravity of the situation and just how hurt people of color in particular were by what took place.
Well, he mentions that students felt unwelcome, confused, and scared. Did you speak with any of the students?
I did. I heard the same sorts of things that Dr. Abraham has heard. Probably one of the more disturbing conversations I had when I was in town was with a young woman named Janiah Haynes. And she's an African-American undergraduate. She's working and going to school at the same time, just trying to get an education. She told me a story about around the time that Jack Thomas was fired. She was walking, it was dark outside. She was walking to her car. She was planning to go to McDonald's or something. And a red pickup truck slowed down at an intersection by her and yelled a racial epithet and said black people shouldn't be out at night. She was truly frightened and just decided to go back into her apartment. I heard other versions of this type of story from other people.
Jack Stripling, you have presented such a rich story that gets right at the heart of the us and them racial divide that is playing out in America. And I'm just so grateful that you were willing to share that with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
We have a postscript to this story. Just as we finished production on this episode, we got word that Jack Thomas has a new job. In July 2020, he'll become the 9th president of Central State University. It's a historically black college in Ohio. You've been listening to Us and Them. Our team for this episode is me, Trey K., Marisa Helms, and Kate Smith. Thanks to Jack Stripling for talking to me about his excellent story, Fear of a Black Campus. The piece was published November 1st, 2019, in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And special thanks to James Muhammad of Lakeshore Public Media in Northwest Indiana for letting me know about this story. Michael Lipton and Tristan Lozow wrote and performed the Us and Them show music. Mark Lerner designed our logo. The wonderful people at PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the West Virginia Humanities Council, and the CRC Foundation. Us and Them was originally developed with assistance from the mentorship program at AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio. We'll see you next time on Us and Them.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.